It's a great pleasure to have Mark Dayton here. Hopefully you've got a handout that he'll be walking through in his presentation. After the presentation, we'll have a sit-down conversation. I'll get things kicked off, and then we'll start rotating the questions. And please give a warm welcome to Senator Mark Dayton.
Thank you, Larry, for that kind introduction. Thank you for your courtesy in not mentioning my campaigns that didn't turn out as well as the ones that you cited. I can only assume that the empty chairs here were the people who read the information about the title of my remarks this morning before they decided not to come, tax equity. And those of you who did come either didn't see that ahead of time, or I'd like to believe saw the title and are such dedicated scholars and students of the public interest that you chose to come anyway. So I thank you very much for giving me this time to share with you. And I recall back in 1986 when Senator Bill Bradley, as most of you know, All-American basketball player at the University of Princeton, All-Pro basketball player for the New York Knicks, very famous for those accomplishments, as well as being a Rhodes Scholar, persuaded the Reagan administration to allow him to perform major surgery on the federal tax code to achieve tax equity. And to some people's surprise, the president and his administration signed off on that as long as it remained revenue neutral. So his next task was to persuade the Congress to give up so many of these prized tax loopholes. And he was told, first, of course, you have to go to the House, through the House Ways and Means Committee, chaired by then Dan Rostenkowski of Illinois. And he was told by his colleagues this would be pretty much of an impossible task, even among the Democrats who were then in the majority, who prized those tax advantages that they could provide. So he did two very ingenious things. First, he flew on a Sunday to Chicago and went personally to the home of Chairman Rostenkowski. This was before Rostenkowski went to federal prison. And with bestowing that personal honor, this great basketball star coming to pay his respect, Chairman Rostenkowski said, that's fine as long as you can persuade a majority of my colleagues. So he then went to a number of the House Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee, and they agreed to go along under one condition, that he would agree to play a game of pickup basketball with their caucus. And he steadfastly refused to play basketball in the Senate, but he made this exception for policy reasons, and went out and had a great game of pickup basketball with the House Democrats and wowed them with all of his basketball prowess, and he was therefore able, and probably the last time in the federal level, to get a significant reduction, not total elimination, but a sizable reduction in the tax preferences and advantages that at that point riddled the Senate tax, the federal tax code. Now I lack that basketball prowess, so I'm going to be consigned. I'm certainly willing to go to the homes of any of the leaders in the Minnesota legislature if I'm governor next year, Republicans and Democrats, and I'm certainly willing to go out and, as I did when I was state auditor, play ice hockey with Representative Phyllis Kahn's Golden Seahorses, they're called, on Sunday nights. But I'm afraid if it comes down to basketball, my chances of persuading anybody are going to be fairly limited. So I'm going to have to use the powers of intellectual persuasion, which I'm going to attempt to try out on all of you today. You know, taxes, I believe, are the lubricant for the machinery of our democracy. Without sufficient revenues, the wheels stop turning and the machinery breaks down. It's a good sign that our citizens, our taxpayers, are able to take the basic functioning of government and its services for granted. It's a hallmark of our social stability. You have to travel, as I have, to countries like Iraq and Afghanistan to realize how starkly different life is for citizens in places where they cannot take the basic functioning of government for granted. And yet that reliance becomes challenging when people forget that it is not automatic, that it has to be generated every day. And like any properly oiled machinery, our democratic society has to be retuned, recalibrated, and ever more finely tuned in order to provide optimal performance. Taxes are the source of that social lubricant. They're also the fuel for our social engine. If you put a poorer quality fuel into your car or truck, you get poorer performance. That occurs gradually if it is mixed into the higher quality fuel that remains from previous fuelings. Gradually, however, the poorer quality takes over, and performance and then customer satisfaction suffers. I would contend that progressive taxes constitute a higher quality social fuel and lubricant, whereas more aggressive taxes constitute a lower quality fuel for our social engine. Progressive taxes ideally ensure that everyone, not just the well-off, but everyone, receives the highest quality performance from our shared social engine, regardless of her or his economic status. And I would maintain that if you look back historically, our nation and our state did best when taxes were most progressive and when incomes for everyone were rising in real terms. And that those two outcomes, progressive taxes and increasing real incomes, were complementary to one another, not conflicting. Take, for example, the period immediately following World War II. And I have in a handout here on pages 2 and 3, I'll be referring to initially the top tax rates for the federal and state taxes. Right after World War II, the greatest generation returned home. Those who survived to return home. After heroically saving the world from Nazi extremism, they went to college or back to college under the GI Bill, free and affordable higher education being one of the ingenious social policies of that time, and then went to work building our country. Under a moderate Republican president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the top marginal rate for federal income taxes was 92%. It was 91% for the rest of his 2 terms and all of President Kennedy's presidency. During the 1950s, the federal government built the interstate highway system and made investments in airports, public transit, sewer and water systems, and other infrastructure that provided the foundation of economic growth for our country for the next 50 years. And while they did so, federal expenditures never exceeded federal revenues by more than 3%. By contrast, in the last fiscal year, federal expenditures exceeded revenues by 60%. That's 60%. The state picture is a little more complicated to compare because during the 1970s and early 1980s, the state permitted federal deductibility. However, during Republican Governor Al Qui's term, the top state income tax rate was as high as 17.6%. And for comparative purposes, Governor Perpich, when he lowered the top rate while eliminating the federal deductibility option, the rate went to 9% and then to 8.5%. During Republican Governor Arnie Carlson's 2 terms and during a period of national and state economic expansion, after both economies grew out of the 1990-91 recession, the top state income tax rate remained at 8.5%. And if you look on the graph of the first page of the handout, the effective tax rates by income decile, Minnesota's total state and local tax burden back in 1990, and again 1992 and 1994 under Republican Governor Arnie Carlson, was fairly evenly distributed across our tax-paying citizens by income. Then it started to diverge. Governor Ventura and the legislature took advantage of the state and national economic growth under President Bill Clinton and a Republican Congress, who had put their own fiscal house in order and were running budget surpluses for the first time in 29 years in the non-Social Security operating fund. He and the legislature reduced the income tax rates in all 3 brackets in 1999 and again in 2000. Rate cuts that totaled 11%, 9%, and 8% respectively. Those cuts, followed by the state ostensibly assuming a larger share of the funding for K-12 public education, created a state funding obligation to revenue mismatch that once the state's economic growth slowed, became glaringly obvious. During the past decade, Minnesota's economic performance has consistently lagged behind other states. As Governor Plenty's own Department of Management and Budgets report essentially prepared by the state's private economic forecasting consultant, stated in its most recent, last February's full report, while Minnesota has typically grown at or above the national rate, the state has underperformed the U.S. economy in recent years. That's page 43 for you scholars. It goes on to state that wage and salary income in Minnesota was worse than the United States in 4 of the past 6 years, and personal income growth in Minnesota has been worse than the United States average in 5 of the last 6 years. As a result of this lagging economic performance, coupled with the national Great Recession, Minnesota's total state tax collections, this is state only, not state and local, Minnesota's total state tax collections in fiscal 2011 would be 2% less than in fiscal 2006. Meanwhile, our state's population has increased by almost 200,000 people who are using and needing our public services. Since state revenues have declined, local governments, school districts, cities, counties, and townships have experienced significant cuts in state aid during this decade. They have balanced their own books by cutting people and services and raising property taxes. The total state property tax burden has increased by $3 billion, or about 75%, since Governor Plenty became governor. And the property tax is the most regressive of all the state and local tax burdens. According to the Minnesota Department of Revenue's most recent tax incident study, which I have done more to make famous than any candidate in state history, middle-income taxpayers, those in the 5th and 6th income deciles for you scholars, pay 5 times more a percent of their incomes in property taxes than the wealthiest 1%. Middle-income taxpayers pay 2.5 times more a percent of their incomes in state sales tax than the wealthiest 1%. Whereas the top 1% pay 2.5 times more of a percent of their incomes in state income tax than middle-income taxpayers. That's the difference between progressive taxes and regressive taxes. And it's the principal reason that the divergence in the tax burden has become so pronounced, as shown in the tax incidence chart. So what do the 3 candidates for governor propose to do about this? Well, 2 of the 3, my worthy opponents, propose to make overall state and local taxes more regressive by extending the sales tax to clothing and quote-unquote unspecified consumer services, as Mr. Horner will admit, and to the property tax, as Representative Emmer will not admit. Last week, however, Representative Emmer announced a budget proposal for K-12 public education that would be a 4% cut from what current state law's funding formula requires for the next biennium, and a 13% cut if you include his failure to repay the shift. He's previously called for the elimination of local government aids, a position he has recanted for the purposes of this campaign. But the result of that, or any cutback in local government aid, county aid, would result inevitably in further local government service cuts and higher property taxes. By contrast, I have called for making the state and local tax burden more progressive by increasing the top income tax rate on the top 5% of the state's income earners, which, if you again refer to the tax incident chart, the top 5% are households with incomes above $146,809. I would also add a third property tax bracket to homes worth more than $1 million, eliminate the so-called snowbird tax exemption, and I'm looking at other ways to achieve my goal of making taxes equitable in Minnesota again. Doing so, by the way, would require the wealthiest Minnesotans to pay no higher a percent of their incomes in state and local taxes than they did in 1994, at the end of Governor Arne Carlson's first term. Now, what is the purpose of this exercise? Well, as I stated at the outset, I think fair taxes are healthy for a society. No one likes paying taxes, and it's harder for people to pay taxes the lower their incomes. Requiring them to do so means, in my mind, a moral responsibility for those making tax policies to make those tax burdens fair. I'm not even proposing to make Minnesota's state and local tax burdens truly progressive. Given the national reliance of states and their local governments on inherently regressive taxes like the sales tax and the property tax, that is virtually impossible, or at least politically impossible, to do. Instead, I propose to make them fair. The second compelling reason to raise some people's taxes is to raise the revenues necessary for our future social and economic vitality, to provide sufficient high-quality fuel and lubricant for our social democracy. One of my principal objections to my opponent's budget proposals, at least the 1.5 of them that we have seen thus far, is that they pretend that the very significant cuts they are making will cause no hardships. Mr. Horner talks about reducing state spending by some $3.5 billion through 28 quote-unquote redesigns of state government, none of which he proposes to detail until after the election. Representative Emmer on the spending side, where he's obligated himself to cutting state spending by $6.5 billion after the additional tax cut he proposed, has said only that he will, quote, hold harmless, close quote, K-12 education, which isn't true if you actually look at his numbers. The rest of it, the over $4.5 billion in cuts that would be necessary to eliminate the state's deficit, which he sometimes says he doesn't even believe in, will have to await some future revelation, which may or may not be forthcoming before Election Day. Perhaps both of my opponents have learned from my experience. I was honest and forthright with my budget proposal. I detailed my revenue increase goal and who, if not entirely where, it would come from. I detailed 17 budget cuts, and I invited the Minnesota Business Partnership and the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce to help me find additional cuts, and I welcome your suggestions as well. I've admitted that it's very hard to find additional cuts that will not seriously harm our engine of social improvements and economic growth, especially public education, where almost half of our state budget goes. I pointed out the total state spending for the current biennium is 8.2% less than in the previous biennium. That eliminates some of the so-called excess in government. Most of the rest of it is the muscle and the heart and the soul of what government does for our citizens in this state. You see, 95% of the state's spending goes to public education, 48%, health and human services, 30%, property tax relief and local government aids, 9%, public safety, 5%, and debt service, 3%. That's 95% of the money the state government spends. You could eliminate every state agency, and you could fire every state employee, which I'm not advocating, and you would save about 3/4 of the projected deficit. And then we wouldn't have prisons, highway repairs, or the University of Minnesota. Already, the University of Minnesota has suffered from real funding cuts during the past decade. Tuition is increased by 71% in real dollars and has more than doubled in nominal dollars. The University of Minnesota's tuition is 50% higher than the average tuition of the state universities in our surrounding 4 states, and 1/3 higher than the next highest, the University of Wisconsin. The average medical student at the U of M incurs over $140,000 in additional student debt, on top of what he or she has acquired during their undergraduate years. In 2001, Minnesota spent the 12th highest amount on higher education among the states per $1,000 of personal income. In 2010, Minnesota had dropped from 12th place to 35th place. And that drop was because of a 28% cut in state spending per full-time student at the University of Minnesota and our MnSCU campuses. These cuts and the crisis that they've created in the affordability of public higher education for so many middle-income Minnesota families and their children is unfair to your generation, those of you who are students, and very destructive to the social and the economic future of our state. The university is the premier academic institution in our state. The MnSCU campus and universities play the same vital role in their communities throughout the rest of Minnesota. But if you look at the economic success of Minnesota, you can attribute so much of it directly and indirectly to what has emanated from the University of Minnesota. The taconite industry is still viable today because of research that came out of the University of Minnesota. Medtronic and former Control Data, Unisys, others, and their spinoffs and the next generation of successors have come out of the collaborations between University of Minnesota's doctors and scientists and professors and students. And many of the students graduating from those programs went on to create their own businesses, starting small and employing other well-educated Minnesota graduates from our university and from our MnSCU systems. And they become the success stories, and they grow, and they expand, and they create new success stories. So when I read that the University of Minnesota Law School, for example, is now ranked, and the rankings aren't exact, but let's take them for what they are, 22nd. And my son, who wanted to go to law school, somewhere, found the University of Michigan had a ranking among the top in the nation, public and private, and chose to go there. Now he's transferred back. I'm very grateful because he wants to help me with my campaign. He gets his degree from the University of Michigan. Well, Michigan has greater economic woes than the state of Minnesota, but they've been able to make a commitment to create a premier institution. When I applied to medical school many, many years ago, Minnesota was in the top 8 medical schools in the country. Today it's ranked 11th for primary care, which is still pretty good, but 38th for research. Well, if you go back again and say so many of the companies that have been so successful in terms of our social and economic vitality, in terms of the medical breakthroughs that have added so much to the quality of life of all of us, not to mention our lifespans, and the jobs that they have created, then how can we afford? We cannot afford, I would say, to be 38th among the medical schools in the country in the quality of our research programs. Our future depends upon it. And it's wrong for my generation to tell those of you who are students that you should get as much education as you possibly can, which you should, that it will benefit you and the rest of our society, which it will, but we're not going to help you pay for it. And you have to come out of the University of Minnesota or MnSCU College University tens and $20,000, $30,000 in debt, and then hundreds of thousands more in debt if you want to go on to a graduate program. It's terribly short-sighted, it's terribly misguided, it's terribly wrong. So what's at stake in this debate, in this election, is nothing less than the future of Minnesota. And the evidence shows that we've been most successful, that as Paul Wellstone said, we all do better when we all do better. And I believe that there are some who can afford to contribute more so that we can all do better, so that the vital public institutions of this state remain strong and become even stronger. I'll put the money in education into excellence. I want to retain and enhance the excellence which we already have here at the University of Minnesota, and I want to recreate new excellence where it doesn't exist. I want students who come here to know that they're going to get the best possible education, because that's what you and they are going to need to be competitive in a world's economy that's going to be so much more challenging and difficult in which to be successful than the one we've experienced the last 50 years. But if the greatest generation could come back, and I'm not advocating the rates that we were presented here today in federal or state dollars, but if they were willing to pay progressive taxes so that all of us could have a better life, then how can we deny our children and our grandchildren the same? If we fail to do so, we do so at our peril and at theirs. Thank you very much.
If we were giving prizes for most detailed and fact-based, I think you'd win it. We've been doing this for a while, and I can't remember a candidate coming in with charts and with so much rich data. Let's start, though.
Well, some might say that's my liability.
Let's start with just a kind of factual question. You've talked about closing the $5.8 billion state deficit with about $4 billion coming from taxes. How much do you estimate would come in new revenues from this increased progressive tax on the top 5% that you've talked about today?
Well, I'm still waiting to get the final numbers from the Minnesota Department of Revenue, but it can't be solely from the income tax rate, because I've said that I will keep that rate for Minnesota, the top rate, below the highest national rate, which right now is 11% in Hawaii. So that creates that limit, and then that's why I said I'll look for other ways of doing this by putting a third tax bracket on the property tax, which we used to have in Minnesota on homes worth more than $1 million, by looking to close some of the loopholes, like allowing somebody to go live in Arizona or Florida, where they pay no income taxes and then come for 6 months and a day and declare that as their residence and come back to Minnesota, as some people I know do, for 5 months and 29 days out of the year and pay no taxes whatsoever for all the services that they use. I don't think that's fair. And I'm open to other suggestions. It'd be great if the Humphrey Institute would take that on, or some of you here would take that on as a challenge and an opportunity to help me find other ways that we can make taxes more progressive in Minnesota. I don't have the final answer. What I have is a stated commitment to accomplishing the goal that I've said, because I think it's essential and I think it's fair. And I point out, by contrast, without making this too political, but I point out that my two opponents are both saying they will not raise the income tax $1 on people making $1 million or $5 million or $10 million a year. That's a fundamental difference between us.
Are there any taxes that you would just put off the board in terms of increase, or is it, all of it's fair game at this point?
No, I've said, Larry, that I will only support tax increases that make the overall tax, the state and local burden, more progressive or less regressive, which is what's going to happen. So I'm not going to support taxes that are inherently regressive. I've said I will not support a cigarette tax increase. I'm not going to support a tax on alcohol. There are reasons to do that, some people would say, but that falls most heavily on middle income, lower and middle income, and lower income families. And you raise the price of a pack of cigarettes $1.50, as Mr. Horner proposed. That's money out of the pockets of working people and the poorer people, and that means kids don't have as much to eat or don't have the same quality of food. I mean, those are addictions, and I think you treat addictions as addictions, and you don't penalize the people who are dealing with them economically. So if there's an inherently regressive tax like that, I would not support an increase.
Thank you. How about taxes on gambling, or expanding gambling off of Indian reservations and using the revenue for that?
Well, I've said I would consider, and I don't know whether I'd finally support it or not, but I said I would consider one state-owned and operated casino at the Mall of America or at the airport. It alleviate further concerns that this would take away revenues from tribal operations. That's not my objective, especially those in greater Minnesota, but to take advantage, for example, in the airport, 2/3 of the people going through the airport are people from one part of the state going to another. And so, is that me? My point being, and I'm not a fan of gaming myself. I've found sure ways to lose my money through politics, but I recognize that's what a lot of people want to do, and we need to raise revenues. We all say that the elixir for what ails our state budget and our state is more jobs, and we're all right. Representative Emmer says that, Mr. Horner says that, I say that. More jobs is what everybody should desire and strive for. And hopefully with this recovery slightly improving, Minnesota's jobless picture has improved in the last 2 months. Hopefully that will continue. But in the next 5 months, or after this next governor and legislature take office, they have to balance constitutionally a budget based on a forecast that's made in late February, early March by the state econometric firm. And if you assume that the job numbers then are frozen at that projection, then there's a basic equation to eliminate the deficit. For every $1 of revenue you don't raise, you have to make $1 of cuts. So I'm an equal opportunity revenue raiser. I welcome, again, anyone who has a better suggestion than I've come up with so far for how we can raise revenue fairly and progressively, so that we can forestall the inevitable cuts in education and healthcare and highway construction and police and fire protection that is going to occur for every $1 of revenue we don't raise. And I said before, I think one of the differences is I'm willing to admit that those cuts would be really hard and painful and cause severe difficulty. Can we find ways to make state government more efficient and local governments more efficient? Absolutely. But just to posit 28 redesigns of government as some antiseptic solution, or claim there's $6 billion of waste that the previous governor, Tim Blendy, and the legislature and the press and everybody else has overlooked, you can just find and say, oh, here's the fat, we'll just toss it overboard and now we're free and clear, is pure fiction. So I again, would welcome anybody who can help me find ways to raise revenue so we don't have to make painful cuts and make tuitions higher and property taxes higher and reduce police and fire protections in our local communities.
Thank you, Senator. 1994, the rates you want to head back to in terms of income taxes, lots changed in those many years. And one of the things that's changed is the world and our economies are much more interdependent. We're competing against what's going on in Wisconsin or New York or obviously a whole slew of countries abroad for our products. What are your concerns about some of the backlash or ill effects of raising taxes in terms of disincentives for investment, a drag on the economy, or perhaps the departure of some of the more affluent Minnesotans?
Well, that's the argument that some make, who then, in a sense, hold the public interest hostage to lower taxes for the rich. And I don't accept that equation in the aggregate. And again, the information I was providing earlier, I think, refutes that. President Obama, when he ran 2 years ago, said that he would cut taxes for 95% of the people of this country making below $250,000 a year, and he would raise taxes for the 5% making more than $250,000 a year. And he won the election in the demographic of people making over $250,000 a year by almost 2 to 1, by a higher percentage than he won the election, generally speaking, which says to me that most affluent people are broad-minded and care about this quality of the lives of other people around them. I mean, my family believed that the quality of their success in Dayton's department stores depended on the quality of the community in which they served. So they believed that, those tax dollars, and again, nobody likes to pay them, but if they were going for good public purposes, and also that the employees that they were able to attract and hire and built that success right along with them because of the quality of their education and their productivity, their work ethic, that benefited them directly, my uncles and my father, as well as the community at large. And there was a good synergy going there, and I still believe in that. I mean, I still don't believe that somebody, because they would have to pay 3% higher rate of tax on their income above $150,000 individually, or $173,000 as a couple, would shut down a business and take away 20 or 50 or 100 or more jobs from hardworking Minnesotans and move that somewhere else because they're mad at the governor of Minnesota, especially if they see that money's necessary so we don't have to go to 4-day school weeks and overcrowded classrooms. And I'll take any business leader or any individual who doesn't see that reality, invite them to go with me and go to see these classrooms. Rochester, Minnesota, 5th grade classroom with 35 children and 1 teacher. I mean, I've seen that all over the state. And those are the future employees of these business leaders. And so I guess I really believe that we're all better than that almost entirely, and that we'll rise to this challenge. And that when people see that cutting 1 out of every $6 for things like education and health care is just un-Minnesotan.
You mentioned President Obama's position on whether and which taxes to extend from those that President Bush passed. That's the federal level. And so you're running for governor, in which we're going to be competing against these other states. Wisconsin, for instance, you'll hear businesses talking about, just taking a little trip down 94 East so they can live in Minnesota but run their businesses in Hudson and elsewhere. Do you worry, though, that some of these tax increases might have these spillover effects on our competition with other states? Well,
yes, we have to be aware of that competition. And, I haven't looked at Wisconsin's situation recently, but it strikes me that there's something they're doing that we're not. If they can provide a tuition at the University of Wisconsin for one third less than we are providing it here, a lot of that competition is about, the interest government shows in the businesses, and I'll be second to no one. I'll do everything I can to be the next great jobs governor after Rudy Perpich, and rolling up my sleeves, working with local chambers, local development corporations, and any business that's unhappy with Minnesota, talking with them and the like. Wisconsin has a total of 5% bidding preference for in-state companies, so that if there's a bid, the Wisconsin company's advantage, so they're very parochial about helping their businesses. We should be doing the same. One contractor in Bagley, Minnesota, told me that if he gets a highway construction project in South Dakota, he has to pay a 2% excise tax on the value of all the equipment he takes across the state line. That's a huge advantage for a South Dakota bidder. So in terms of these competitions, and I experienced that when I was Commissioner of Economic Development back in the 70s and 80s, yes, absolutely, we have to be very sensitive to that, and also recognize that if somebody wants to pay no taxes and 50 to 60 cents an hour, they're going to go to China. and they're going to go to Cambodia. And so, our competition is global, even more than it was in previous decades. And again, we have to ask ourselves, what do we offer as a state that's going to be effective? There's a recent report, the Kaufman report, which I think is worth looking at, that says that most jobs are created not even by small businesses, by startups, by entrepreneurs that are starting new businesses. And they found that conversely, again, to popular belief, they're located in better quality environment, higher tax, higher education areas like the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, because we offer well-educated people that they can recruit to build their businesses with them. They're concerned about where their kids go to school. They're concerned about the quality of health care that they and their families can receive. So we have a lot of advantages here that, and if you talk to the state economist or state demographer, they'll tell you if we sacrifice our strengths at the expense of everything I've just described, we're still going to be non-competitive with China, where they're 50, 60 cents an hour. We're going to give up our strengths that we all depend upon and rely upon, and we're not going to have a better economy or a better society to show for it.
Thank you. We've been talking about increasing taxes, particularly on the more affluent. How about tax cuts? President Obama recently came out and said that to spur economic growth, he was willing to allow small businesses to have 100% write-off on their new investments. We've seen various proposals in Minnesota for research and development tax credit, particularly for medical device industries and other areas. What are your views about those sort of targeted tax cuts?
Well, it's wonderful talking about tax cuts, and their economists will say that targeted tax cuts are good for business and for economic growth, and those are important reasons to be in favor of them. And the great advantage that President Obama and the Congress have, as President Bush before him, is they don't have to balance the budget. And as I said earlier, when President Clinton was president and we had a Republican Congress, we had a growing economy, they combined to do something that hadn't been achieved in this country for 29 years. If you set aside the surplus in the Social Security Trust Fund, take the rest of the federal government's operating budget, they created a surplus for the first time in 29 years, for the last 2 years of President Clinton's second term. President Bush saw that and saw it great. I'll follow the Reagan formula. I'll cut taxes and blame the Congress. He cut taxes in 2001, primarily for the rich. Cut taxes again in 2003, primarily for the rich. We've had wars that he hadn't foreseen. We had an economic recession. And during the last year, the 7th year of his 8 years as president, the federal deficit, the expenditures exceeded revenues by 16%. We said that was terrible, it was unsustainable, which it is. The last fiscal year just ended, and now again, in fairness, President Obama inherited that meltdown, but now he and the Congress are responsible for it. Federal expenditures exceeded revenues by 60%. It's going to be about the same in this current federal fiscal year. So, the argument is you stimulate the economy through tax cuts and targeted expenditures, and the economists will agree with that. And certainly given the nature of our economic condition in this country today, those are justified in the short term, and they add to the deficit, both of them, and if they don't produce the desired economic growth, we're even in a deeper hole in the time to come. But some of that's all beside the point, because in Minnesota, like almost every other state, constitutionally you have to balance the budget. And I would agree with some of Representative Emmer's tax proposals in concept. The 10% waiver for Subchapter S and other small businesses that would allow them to retain earnings that they could reinvest in their business. I think that's a good idea. I think the corporate income tax is regressive in Minnesota, and that the smaller businesses that do most or all of their business in the state pay a higher effective tax rate than the larger corporations, the multinational corporations, where the three-part apportionment formula reduces their effective rate quite considerably. And I would like to do something about that. And that adds, as Representative Emmer did, $626 million to a deficit already projected at $5.8 billion. So that's now he's up to over $6.5 billion. And so then where are you going to make the offsetting cuts in the short term? And that's the question he won't answer.
I asked a moment ago about the biotech industry, which is, of course, one of our...
Research and development would be another area we absolutely want to recognize and provide incentives. Angel investor tax credit was passed the last time. Representative member voted against it, but it was good that it passed. Governor Plenty signed it in law. And, those are kind of incentives for investment here and for research and development, absolutely. And having the University of Minnesota Medical School ranked 38th for research has, I would argue, an even greater adverse effect on R&D coming into the state's economy than anything else I'm aware of so far.
Do you have a plan then for, let's say, the biotech industry? It sounds like tax cuts would be on the table, improving the standing of the University of Minnesota's medical school. Is that what the plan would look like in general terms?
Well, Governor Purvich had a sign on his office wall, which I'll put back up there if I'm elected governor. It said, "None of us are as smart as all of us." And I would, if I'm elected, in 50 days, sit down with the leaders in the biotech business community and with those involved in related fields here at the University of Minnesota and say, what do you need? What would be most effective in giving you the capital for investment and giving you the skilled employees, giving you the access to the most advanced research and information, and how do we create a synergy? There's been talk about a research corridor from the Twin Cities metropolitan area down to Rochester. Certainly Rochester has a very strong medical community. The Mayo is the largest private employer in the state, and they have a medical school there, which is outstanding. And so, there's a whole opportunity, I think, especially in the biomedical field. But I would defer to those entrepreneurs and business leaders who would have greater expertise and assess with them what can we do to create the best incentives so Minnesota can be premier, as we must be, as we should be, and as we will be if I can have possible say in it as governor.
I've got a number of questions here on taxes from folks in the audience here. Let me tick through some of them quickly. Would you favor, if you would tax luxury homes more, how about higher taxes on luxury goods, such as cars, boats, and jewelry?
Well, then you get into the sales tax. I would look at that as if you can limit them to progressive, make the sales tax, which, as I said earlier, is steeply regressive, to make it more progressive. So I'd look at luxury items if you can isolate those.
You've been pretty clear that you think sales taxes are inherently regressive, hitting the lower income groups more. Could you see a way in which a sales tax could be made progressive? Well,
I think the luxury good items would be candidates. I mean, that's the principle I'll apply to any tax increase proposal. If it makes the overall taxes less regressive, more progressive, I'll certainly look at it. Extending the sales tax to clothing, as Mr. Horner's proposed, is regressive. Extending the sales tax to all consumer services, or whichever $2.8 billion of the $5.4 billion total that he won't specify, but that's inherently car repair and haircuts and individual purchases of lawyers and accountants and bank services, invest stockbrokers, people who make their own investments as their own brokers. I mean, taxing all that and turning all of those service businesses into tax collectors for the state is really a hornet's nest, and I don't think he's acknowledged the practical difficulties of it, and he certainly hasn't acknowledged the fact that it's a more regressive tax, nor has he explained why, again, he thinks that's better to impose additional taxes on middle income and working families and lower middle income families and poorer families than he would on the richest people in the state by not raising their income taxes by even $1.
One of the questions from our audience, are you engaging in class warfare?
Well, I didn't start the war. Look at the divergence on those charts. Back under a DFL governor, Rudy Purvich, and a Republican governor, Arnie Carlson, there was fairly good tax equity. And look where it is today, and I haven't had anything to do with any of those policies. And, it's the Minnesota Department of Revenue's numbers that I'm bringing into more public awareness that the, richest 5% of the people in Minnesota pay about 3/4, and those are people with incomes, household incomes above $146,000, 800 and some. They pay about 75% of the percent of their income in state and local taxes compared to everyone else, compared to people making $30,000 a year, $50,000 a year, $75,000 a year, and so forth. And the richest 1% of Minnesotans, who are people whose average incomes exceed $1.2 million a year, pay only 2/3 of the percent of their income in state and local taxes compared to everyone else. Those are the facts. You can call it what you will. I just want to require the richest 5%, the richest 1% of the people to pay the same percent, just the same percent of their income in state and local taxes as everyone else. And that would not raise their effective tax rate above what it was in 1994 under Republican Governor Ernie Carlson. I think that's just reasonable, fair, equitable tax policy. And we need the money. And if you look at the alternatives, how my two opponents propose to raise some revenues, not as much, and where they won't tell you they're going to make the cuts that are going to be necessary to offset every dollar of revenues they won't raise, then you can assess, and Minnesotans can assess for themselves, which plan is fair, which plan is better for most of Minnesota, which plan is going to fund our University of Minnesota and our colleges, other colleges and universities, and our public schools and early childhood education and our highways and our police and fire services in ways that give us the quality of life that we need, spur economic growth for the future, the jobs of the future, the kind of jobs that people are going to want to have that can raise a family on, and are fair in terms of the revenues we need to raise to do the work.
We've been talking about tax policy. Your proposal also talks about making cuts in spending. Could you give us some sense of specifically what you have in mind and the magnitude of spending cuts?
If you go to my website, www.markdayton.org, I listed $679 million going from reducing the outsourcing of contracts, state contracts, to private vendors. Wisconsin did their equivalent of their legislative auditor did an analysis that was more costly for the state than qualified public employees performing the same work. In some cases, it's probably less, in which case we'll keep it. If it's more, we should bring that in-house. I, based on my experience as Commissioner of Economic Development, think that the Minnesota Trade Office is something that we would be better at not spending dollars on, given the priorities that we have. That I've been to China 7 times, 6 times the last year. I met at a very high level of government to government, including with President Hu Jintao twice. And I know that the Chinese leaders expect to meet with government leaders and not with others. And government leaders that can bring, as Governor Plenty is doing this week in China, and can bring business leaders into opportunities in those countries. But I think it's better handled and far more cost-effectively handled out of the governor's office. We impose, because of the federal and state mandate, 61 tests on our school children from grades 3 through 11. I'd cut that by more than half. I'd work with the Obama administration to remove a lot of that onerous testing, especially the kind of testing that occurs at the end of the winter or early spring, and where the schools don't get the results till after the school year is over, which means it's obviously not about improving individual student performance. It's about blaming the schools. I'd remove that kind of testing at savings. And then I said you could itemize the proposals. And again, I'm looking for more. I've asked the Minnesota Business Partnership and the Minnesota Chamber, and I invite everyone else to help me find other areas where we can cut.
Senator Dayton, Governor Plenty has made a crusade on restraining, or at least slowing, the rate of growth in health care. This is one of the big drivers of the state budget. It's a very large portion of our spending. Do you agree with them that healthcare spending is a kind of an imminent threat to our budget, and what would you do about it?
Well, I agree with Governor Plenty that it's a driving factor in really all state budgets, or almost all that I'm aware of, as well as the federal government. Governor Plenty, you showed us the wrong way to approach changing that last spring by, proposing this just meat cleaver approach to GAMC and throwing the poorest of the poor off of the health care that they had. And then they had a so-called compromise, which results in only 4 of the 21 hospitals that provide care to the poorest of the poor, and they're all in the metro area. So as my excellent running mate, Yvonne Pretner-Solon, points out, and there's a client who's been, a story has been made public, so we could refer to it. It was a young man with schizophrenia up in Duluth, and His mother has to leave her job for 2 days in Albert Lea, drive up to Duluth, pick him up, drive him down to the Twin Cities where he can get the prescriptions he needs and the medical treatment, to drive him back to Duluth and drive him to Albert Lea. I mean, that's just cruel punishment. And it's more costly because it forces patients onto a more expensive emergency room care. The governor's also declined to early opt-in into Medicaid, which, by the way, was not something created by President Obama. It was something created by President Lyndon Johnson about 40 years before. And by not taking $1.4 billion in federal money for $188 million net state investment, he's again denying the poorest of the poor quality medical care, and he's costing Minnesota more money because those people will go to emergency rooms, and he's also denying hospitals, especially in greater Minnesota, who don't have the financial resources, he's denying them the financial stability they need to provide quality health care for everybody.
So it's clear that you disagree with how Governor Pawlenty has gone about it, but how would you restrain health care spending? What is your general approach to getting a handle on this spike?
Well, for the last decade, Larry, I believe that we need to provide affordable health care for all Americans and all Minnesotans, and the better way to do that is through a Medicare for everyone, where Medicare spends 97 cents out of every dollar for health care. United Healthcare, the largest health insurance company, reports a quarterly profit of over $1 billion. And by their own financial report, for every health care premium dollar they take in, they spend only 81 cents for health care. So that difference between 81 cents, and some people say it's actually lower for some of the health insurance companies, and 97 cents on the dollar is one of the reasons that health care is so expensive, and health insurance is so unaffordable for Minnesotans, and then the health care is unaffordable even when they have health insurance. I know a woman told me in St. Louis Park, she's a middle-aged woman, a single person. She gets the best insurance she can get through her small business employer. Costs her $7,000 a year for health insurance, but she still has to pay with the deductible of the first $5,000 for health care and the first $2,000 for prescription drug coverage. She pays up to $7,000 a year out of her own pocket before the $7,000 she's paying for health insurance pays in 1 penny. I mean, that's just terribly, terribly wrong. And so we've got to get out of this system where there's all this profiteering and where people are placed ahead of profits in the provision of health care. And if we did it efficiently, if we had doctors in charge of health care decisions, not second-guessed by bean counters and administrators, and we put every dollar into health care, we'd have a better quality health care, and I think we'd have a lower cost health care.
I'm curious how you think about this moment in Minnesota history. We're seeing some extraordinary signs of public distrust. A recent poll we did with Minnesota Public Radio News showed that 75% of Minnesotans, including many Democrats, distrust the federal government to do the right thing. Is this a difficult time to make the case for progressive taxation and progressive use of government when you've got so many Minnesotans who just don't trust the government?
It is. I mean, of course, I didn't create a $6 billion deficit, and I wish there weren't one that had to be addressed through anything, revenue increases or spending cuts. I'm much more focused on state government. I don't know if your poll isolated them, but I find I've had 110 community meetings around the state, and I can count on one hand with fingers left over the number of people who have said to me, I'm receiving better quality service from a state agency than I was 10 years ago. And one of the problems I'm up against is we've had all these years now of people who run for office on the ideology that government does everything badly, and then if they're elected or appointed, they go out to prove themselves correct. And they defund the programs, or they destroy the programs, or they provide worse service because they don't care about government. And then they come back and say 4 years later, well, see, we've proved our point. We've made government worse, so re-elect us, we'll make it worse again. So, I mean, I'm very concerned, again, as a citizen of this democracy, about people's loss of faith and trust in government as we the people. And if that's broken down, if people believe that every tax dollar is wasted, and can we find efficiencies? Yes. Must we? Absolutely, because we're not going to have the resources we've had in the past under whatever system we want to approach to do what we've done before. We have to find greater efficiencies. But if people don't believe that government cares about them, that those of us, and I will instill this ethic if I'm governor, I will send an executive order on day one that arrogance ends, indifference ends. If we're elected, appointed, or hired by the people of Minnesota as public servants, our job is to provide the best possible public service we can. And it doesn't mean we can do everything everybody wants us to do, but it means we can be responsible, it means we can be attentive, it means we can be curious, it means we can give timely responses, and I will do everything I possibly can to instill that ethic in government throughout this state.
You talked several times about finding greater efficiencies in government. Do you have a particular set of ideas about how to do that? You know, for instance, there were some DFL legislators who were talking to the Pawlenty administration by looking for ways in which some of the school districts could share services and save millions of dollars, or the governor's talked about consolidating some of the units of government. What are your ideas about how to gain those efficiencies?
Of course, then when a lot of the school districts wanted to pool and buy health insurance through a pool to have lower prices, better coverage, the governor vetoed it. So, you know, I mean, I think local governments are looking at school administrators, I mean, school boards. I mean, the imperative has been to look for efficiencies, and we need to find greater. School consolidations have been part of the landscape of Minnesota for the last 20 years. I mean, counties are, you know, they combine services cooperatively? Yes, and they should. And one of my former associates had an operation called a Board of Local Government Innovation, where there were grants provided, then Republican Phil Krinke eliminated it. But there are opportunities there for finding greater efficiencies. I mean, you also have to remember that the county seats are economic engines for the areas, as are the schools, as are the college and university campuses around the state. Those are incredibly important job providers, and also quality jobs, and also brings quality people. And so just to say you're going to obliterate them, again, sort of like GMC with a meat cleaver without understanding the social and economic consequences, I think is misguided. But to get them to collaborate and cooperate and combine services while still leaving the service delivery out in especially greater Minnesota, where the geographical distances are much wider, is something that I will absolutely be doing. And I will bring professionals into every state agency who care about the mission of that agency, and they're going to bring in deputies with them and other administrators whose jobs are going to be to find these efficiencies. Absolutely. There was a Cirrus, a company up in Duluth, makes aircraft. They talk about lean inventory. They talk about lean process, where they're as lean as possible. I want state government, local government to be as lean as possible and still deliver quality services.
Thank you very much. You have an agenda that is going to be difficult to move in the legislature. Here we had, in this last session, a legislature that had super majorities of Democrats, and even under those conditions, they passed the tax increases of about $435 million. We're probably going to see, let's assume we're going to see a change in some of those majorities in this election. And so things will be even more difficult, or as difficult. What is your leadership style in trying to bring together a coalition that would pass your tax increases?
Well, when working for Governor Purpich, I think I saw that no matter who's governor, and no matter who are the 201 legislators, there are 201 legislators who are convinced they have better ideas than the governor. And that's also healthy, because that means, you know, again, none of us are as smart as all of us, and so we'll have a collaborative process. I pride myself on my ability to work with anyone who can work with me. I've proven that throughout my time as state government, and one of the proudest accomplishments I had when I was in the U.S. Senate. My last year, I worked with Senator John McCain, with then the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Ted Stevens, may he rest in peace, to get the first congressional funding for the Beyond the Yellow Ribbon program, the pioneering program of the Minnesota National Guard, to provide supportive services to our returning heroes from Iraq and Afghanistan and to their families. And I worked across the aisle to accomplish that, and I'll work with whoever can work with me and will work with me collaboratively to achieve our objective. The one thing I'll say is I'll put out a budget. That's the job of a governor. And it's kind of like now during this campaign, when I put my budget out first, everybody can throw their darts at it, and they're still going to have to come up with an alternative that's better than mine. If they can come up with a better one, more power to them. And there are components of better ideas in there. We'll absolutely incorporate them into the final product. However, someone's going to not just be able to do political posturing. If they don't like my budget, they're going to have to propose their alternative. And this is not going to be easy. There's no easy way. And there's probably no universally popular way to solve a $6 billion deficit. And neither the new governor or any of the new legislators is responsible for that, and we also will take on the responsibility to do so, and I promise I'll do so fairly and equitably and with what I believe is in the best interests of all of Minnesota, politics aside.
So open door policy, politics aside.
Good people, professionals, people committed to the agencies, professional managers, people who want to make these agencies work more efficiently, an honest budgeting process, a collaborative process. I'll work with the legislature. I won't be off running for president. I'll be actually in Minnesota, actually working day and night with my sleeves rolled up. Yvonne Pretner-Solon with me. We'll work with every legislator. We'll work with every constituent group. We'll work with everyone who has better ideas for a better Minnesota.
And does that come with the recognition that to build coalitions often means to compromise and accept things that you might not prefer?
I've learned in government you have to, and certainly in the legislative process, you have to compromise. You don't compromise your principles. But you compromise positions because you say, this is only half of what I want, but it's better than none of what I want. And if people understand that in order to get a working, a viable majority, then people understand, well, he didn't get everything. He got part of what he wanted, and the part he didn't get, he would have gotten if he had a majority. Then they can decide 2 years later whether they want to create that majority to carry out more of the mandate or not. That's called democracy.
So would we expect to see government shutdowns under a Dayton administration?
No, we expect to see the legislature go home on time.
Thank you. Let me ask one last question. You've talked about leadership styles. Is there someone that stands out for you as a role model that you think of as this is the way you ought to govern?
Well, Abraham Lincoln, I don't put myself in this category, but he said, I do the best I can. I mean to keep doing so until the end. If the end turns me out right, what is said about me now won't matter. If the end turns me out wrong, 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference.
Thank you very much, Mark Dayton, for a really quite stimulating conversation.
Thanks very much.